Which claim should Americans believe? And by what standard do we determine the moral compass for what is right and wrong in our society?
Whatever we once were, we are no longer a Christian nation.
This nation was founded primarily on Christian principles.
You ask, what would the American public say if they actually understood the background to what became the sexual revolution, a sexual psychopath?
Researchers argue that America's current problem with sexual predators is the fallout from the sexual revolution, a movement said to be inspired by the late Alfred Kinsey and his famous Kinsey Reports, first published in 1948. According to the conservative organization Human Events, the Kinsey Report is listed among the top 10 most harmful books of the 19th and 20th centuries. Number 1 on their list was the Communist Manifesto that inspired the deaths of more than 100 million people in the 20th century alone. Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf that helped to bring about the Holocaust was listed at number 2. While the quotations from Chairman Mao, who founded Communist China, was number 3. At number 4, as the first American title on the list, was the Kinsey Reports. Sexual behavior in the human male, followed by sexual behavior in the human female, which, when first released, was likened to dropping an atom bomb on American society. In 1989, a report from the National Research Council published a statement that American society can be divided into 2 categories, the pre-Kinsey and post-Kinsey eras. How could one man's influence come to define our culture and produce what some consider the most harmful book in American history?
It would find its way into every aspect of our decision-making in our lives.
Dr. Judith Reisman is renowned for her expertise on the damaging influence of pornography. She is author of the book, Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences, in which she details the devastating impact of Alfred Kinsey in America. An influence she believes is behind the growing number of sexual predators who seem to come from all walks of life.
Teachers, doctors, lawyers, judges, people are being caught right and left, sacrificing their lives and their families' lives to their addictions to child pornography. How do you think it happened? It did not start today. It started back with Kinsey, and who then kicked off what has become today's horror show. Child sexual abuse, rape, torture. People say, well, you can't track that all to Kinsey. Well, you can track enough of it to make an awfully frightening case.
Here's Larry Don McQuaid, the 41-year-old former school bus driver who's confessed to sexually abusing more than 200 children.
I was able to manipulate parents and children alike, that I was such a nice guy that I wouldn't do something as wrong and disgusting and as that. I consider myself a demon.
For years, Americans have wondered why repeat sex offenders so often receive light prison sentences only to be released back into society.
The laws were changed based upon his fraudulent data, and he was directly involved in those changes. Kinsey went state by state. I have his testimony in California in 1949, telling a committee that was about to toughen the sex laws and toughen up about the laws to protect children because there'd been a murder of 2 little girls. He goes to California to testify in 1949 that you should release everybody, that pedophiles and pederasts did not repeat their crimes, that parole was absolutely critical, that would reduce our sex crimes. The committee believes him. They reduce all of our sex crimes. They parole people, and they haven't stopped.
Well, some of the experts say that once a pedophile, always a pedophile, that recidivism is 80 or 90%, if not more.
When the Kinsey Report was first released, the famous ACLU lawyer, Morris Ernst, wrote that virtually every page of the Kinsey Report touches on the legal code. He told the legal profession that no bar association, law school journal, or lawyers' committee can consider sex laws without the Kinsey study. According to Westlaw, the most widely used legal database, between the years 1982 to 2000, there were approximately 650 citations to Alfred Kinsey.
The model penal code that was adopted just after 1955 was based on Kinsey's research.
This is a flow chart I put together to describe how the Kinsey research gutted American laws. Through the American Law Institute, ALI, the American Law Institute Model Penal Code, 1955. That was where protections were then removed for women and children from American law system. The U.S. justice system from 1948 to today, that's what this is about.
After publishing his reports, Kinsey traveled the country, giving lectures at universities and testifying before lawmakers. He was received as the leading scientific expert in the world on human sexuality. In particular, he discussed laws concerning sex offenders and the education of children.
Of children, he said 100% are orgasmic from birth. Therefore, children can benefit from sex with adults and even incest, which is illegal, so we need to lower the age of consent. He was working toward making everything legal, but that's all right. Children need early explicit school sex education since they're sexual from birth, which was illegal at the time. Now it's everywhere. They need masturbation and hetero and homosexual acts to be taught to them, which was illegal, and now it's being taught. And about parole, Kinsey said that sex offenders rarely repeat sex crimes. Therefore, all sex offenders should be paroled, which is exactly what started to take place.
Part of Kinsey's defense of pedophiles was that children were not really harmed by sexual contact with adults. Therefore, it made no sense to incarcerate pedophiles for lengthy prison terms.
1950, Rockefeller funded the American Law Institute Model Penal Code. 1952, a Harvard Law Review called for a code to change our sex laws in accordance with what Kinsey had objectively found. And then in 1955, the code was created and sent out to all legislators in the country via these important people, judge, lawyers, sociologists, lawyers, and so forth. And from there, that went the ALI model, the sex offenses section, sent to states all over the country, adopted all or in part beginning in 1956 here and moving on to Illinois, to Minnesota and so forth, and all other states of the Union.
As Dr. Reisman noted, the Model Penal Code was financed by the Rockefeller Foundation. Not coincidentally, the Rockefeller Foundation also financed the research of Alfred Kinsey. In the 1950s, a congressional committee was formed under Congressman B. Carroll Reese to investigate the influence of the large tax-exempt foundations, including Rockefeller.
There was a huge concern at the time in the 1950s that the foundations were now being run by people with a strikingly strident a libertarian or liberal agenda, which resisted and resented the Judeo-Christian way of life.
The late Norman Dodd was the director of research for the Reese Committee. In an interview recorded shortly before his death, Dodd stated that part of what the committee had learned was that the objective of the great foundations was to remove America from the values on which she was built and to do so through the education system.
What we had uncovered was the determination of these large endowed foundations, this Carnegie Endowment story and the Ford Foundation and the Guggenheim and the Rockefeller Foundation, all working in harmony toward the control of education in the United States.
Dodd's testimony becomes an important issue when considering the direct impact of Kinsey's research on sex education in America. While the Reese Committee investigated many programs funded by the foundations, when it came to Kinsey's research, they were vehemently opposed by the late Congressman Wayne Hayes.
That's established quite well in Renee Wormser's book on foundations, their power and influence, a book that no American who wants to understand what happened to our country should be without.
Renee Wormser was the lawyer for the Reese Committee. In his book, Wormser writes that the committee had dug up some significant material about foundation support of the Kinsey projects. This brought Mr. Hayes into a steaming rage, he says, and he asked to see our entire Kinsey file. It was produced for him, and he angrily declared to Mr. Dodd that we were to go no further with this particular investigation. contending that every member of Congress would be against our doing so. Mr. Hayes stated emphatically to Mr. Dodd that he would oppose any further appropriation to our committee unless the Kinsey investigation were dropped. Wormser writes that as a result, the valuable material in our Kinsey file never saw the light of day. Some believe that if Kinsey's research had been exposed in the 1950s, the information might have sparked a second American Revolution. What was in the Kinsey file, and does that information continue to influence or even haunt America? Through the 1930s and 40s, Alfred Kinsey conducted thousands of interviews with both men and women, taking, as he called it, their sexual histories. The purpose of his study was to discover the sexual behavior of the average man and woman in America at the time. Kinsey was a professor at the University of Indiana in Bloomington. Despite his Christian upbringing, he would come to reject the Judeo-Christian belief of his family in favor of Darwinian philosophy, accepting the idea that man is simply a more highly evolved animal. Upon interviewing thousands of volunteer subjects, Kinsey not only recorded data, but drew certain conclusions about the sexual behavior of men, women, and children. But was his research that of an objective scientist, or the intentional manipulation of a sexual deviant who wanted to remake the American male and female in his own image?
Kinsey has legitimized the free sex revolution, and he did it through academia. But what's interesting, according to research that's been done on this gentleman, this guy was a pervert himself.
Kinsey's critics claimed that his real motive was not science, but a social agenda to change the morality of America, something admitted by Kinsey biographer Jonathan Gaythorne Hardy.
It's abundantly clear as you go into it that there was a very large social agenda. He didn't just want a greater tolerance and sanity from understanding the facts of sex. He thought it was quite monstrous the way homosexuals were regarded. In general, there was a very powerful social agenda, which is perfectly plain when you read the book, from the polemic right the way through it, and was perfectly plain at the time to the people who worked with him.
When the Kinsey reports were published, they shocked the country, because the behavior that Kinsey described did not at all represent what most Americans believed about their own sexuality. Consider that Kinsey was documenting the behavior of the World War II era, those that Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. Among Kinsey's more controversial claims is the idea that 10% of American men were fully homosexual for at least 3 years of their life, while 37% of American men had engaged in homosexual contact to the point of orgasm at least once in their lives. Nevertheless, Kinsey's data was seized upon by men like Harry Hay, who read the Kinsey reports, left his wife and children, and went on to found the gay rights revolution that began in the 1960s. To this day, the gay rights movement is largely based on Kinsey's data. Kinsey also reported high levels of premarital sex, claiming that 69% of American men had visited prostitutes and that 50% of married men were guilty of adultery. Again, a later study done as early as 1960 by Phyllis and Eberhard Kronhausen would find that the levels of sexual promiscuity among males were much lower than Kinsey had reported. According to his fellow researchers, the reason for this dramatic difference is because Kinsey manipulated the data, including men from America's prisons, as part of the regular male population.
He wrote that he found 1,300 to 1,400 sex offenders that he used as his normal male population. What?
In addition to the convicted sex offenders, Kinsey included regular prisoners who were serving time for other offenses, along with 199 sexual psychopaths, all mixed together as part of the regular male population and presented to the American people as the average American male. In this interview for the documentary titled 1 in 10, Listen as Paul Gebhardt, who was one of Kinsey's co-authors and a member of his original team, admits to the high percentage of prisoners and their impact on Kinsey's data.
With these poorer, lower educational level samples. And when I say poorer, they had, for example, 55% were prison. 55% were prison. And I think that has a definite effect. We know we didn't have enough non-prison people to do much of a comparison, but he didn't do a comparison. He simply took the prison people he got and used them with that less than college educated sample. But the trouble was, by, you might say, emphasizing the less than college educated sample, he introduced a lot of errors into the data.
To create high levels of homosexual activity, Kinsey also went into Chicago's underground, into gay bars and homosexual bathhouses, and incorporated the radically gay population into his regular male data, along with bootleggers, gamblers, male prostitutes, ne'er-do-wells, pimps, thieves, and hold-up men, all this according to his own report. Kinsey used similar tactics to redefine the average American female.
They use this picture all the time to try and show the American public that they were interviewing average American women, all right? Except that this was their secretary, okay? This is a secretary at the Kinsey Institute, and they would always label her as though she was just some average American woman. Sometimes they put Kinsey in the picture interviewing her, and sometimes they put him. And now, after I exposed that in one of my books, the Kinsey Institute has now admitted on its website, they give the name of her so it doesn't look as though they're trying to phony the thing.
To create high levels of female promiscuity among American wives, Kinsey redefined married women to include any woman that had lived with a man for at least a year, a broad description that could include prostitutes who had lived with their pimps. In fact, prostitutes were a subculture that Kinsey specifically sought out, mixing them in with the regular female population. As a result, Kinsey's report stated that some 50% of American women engaged in premarital sex, while 26% of married women were supposedly involved in adultery. Kinsey went on to report that an incredible 87% of unmarried women were having abortions, while 25% of married wives were also aborting. It was these high percentages, shocking even by today's standards, that would help to legalize abortion in the years that would follow. As Reece Committee lawyer Renee Wormser states in his book, the much publicized Kinsey studies base an advocacy of criminal and social reform on the very unscientific material which Dr. Kinsey had collected. Wormser went on to cite psychiatric historian Albert Deutsch, who said of the Kinsey reports that so startling are its revelations, so contrary to what civilized man has been taught, that they would be unbelievable but for the impressive weight of the scientific agencies backing the survey. Wormser comments saying, "Note how impressive is the word scientific and how false." But he goes on to suggest even more, revealing that, according to the Reece Committee, the postmodern thinking in America today is no mere accident, but has been intentionally created by the elite foundations as part of a greater agenda, one in which the work of Kinsey plays no small part. The Reece Committee wrote that it seems to this committee that there is a strong tendency on the part of many of the social scientists whose research is favored by the major foundations toward the concept that there are no absolutes, that everything, including basic moral law, is subject to change, however fundamental it may have been deemed to be under our Judeo-Christian moral system. The puerile doctrine that change is always necessary has led many of these scientists to believe that there are no longer any inalienable rights. They deem themselves justified, with the support of foundation grants, to label their prejudices as truth, and to experiment with society. By far, the most disturbing evidence against the Kinsey reports is the information pertaining to the sexual behavior of children. This was something noted in the 1950s by Professor Albert Hobbs, who wrote that, according to Kinsey, a child molester may have contributed favorably to a child's later sociosexual development. The child sexual data was more fully exposed by Dr. Judith Reisman in the 1980s, who brought the even more disturbing allegation that Kinsey had trained multiple pedophiles to molest children while using stopwatches to record so-called scientific data.
This man, this Kinsey, had been responsible for the rapes and tortures of hundreds, actually it looks like thousands of children.
Needless to say, the Kinsey Institute today denies Dr. Reisman's allegations. They maintain that all of the child sexual data came from one man, who just happened to keep detailed scientific records of his encounters with children. This lone pedophile theory was developed by Dr. John Bancroft, who became the director of the Kinsey Institute in 1995. Bancroft not only argued that the data came from just one man, but that Kinsey supposedly only got hold of the information years after this pedophile was finished raping kids. This is contrary to Kinsey's own report, in which he admitted to at least 9 pedophiles from whom he obtained information. When questioned about the obvious inconsistency, Bancroft's argument is that Kinsey simply lied about his research.
Did he make it clear in the report that the conclusions on the sexual capacity of 317 children were based solely on the evidence of one sexual criminal?
No, he suggested that it may have been from 3 or 4. I don't think that is a particularly important difference. Kinsey...
But isn't that conspicuously misleading?
I think he was misleading. I think that he
I'm sorry, you don't think he was misleading? Forgive me?
Yes, I think he was misleading, but I don't think it was a misleading of any consequence. He was concerned about his maintaining confidentiality. Throughout his volumes, he tended to avoid drawing attention to any particular individuals.
It's not significant that the conclusions of a study on the sexual responses of children come solely from a man who really has who's a deviant? Doesn't he have a skewed perception of child sexuality?
Well, that was just one type of evidence. There is no reason to say that Kinsey has been dishonest. He probably had a good reason for obscuring whether it was 1 or 3 men. That is a minor detail.
The minor detail of Kinsey's data may have had a major impact on America's children, especially when one considers that now, decades later, 1 in 4 teenage girls are currently infected with some kind of sexually transmitted disease. And according to the White House Office of National AIDS Policy, in the U.S., it is estimated that 2 young people aged 13 to 25 are infected with HIV each hour. Furthermore, should Americans trust information about child sexuality from child molesters who were raping kids? But where did Kinsey get his information? Did it really come from just one man? The allegedly lone pedophile that Bancroft and the Kinsey Institute point to was known as Mr. Green in Kinsey's research. His real name was Rex King, a man who kept written diaries in which he claimed to have molested more than 800 children. Like most pedophiles, King was never caught and never served a day in prison. The Kinsey Institute usually presents King as a man who simply kept meticulous records and mysteriously came into contact with Kinsey. This same idea was presented in the Hollywood film Kinsey, starring Liam Neeson. But what Kinsey supporters do not reveal is that Mr. Green had been personally trained by Kinsey's mentor, Dr. Robert Dickinson. Something admitted by Paul Gephardt in the 1998 British documentary, Kinsey's Pedophiles.
Kinsey was told about Green by his own mentor in sex research, Dr. Robert Dickinson. Dickinson had collaborated with the pedophile for several years and taught him how to record his child abuse in scientific detail.
Following the example of his mentor, Dr. Robert Dickinson, Kinsey set out to train his own predators, men who would collect information about what can only be called the sexual torment of children. Gephardt said, Green contributed a fair amount to our knowledge and medicine's knowledge of sexuality in children. We made our point that children are sexual from birth. But the sexuality of these children was determined because, according to Kinsey's interpretation, the children supposedly enjoyed the molestation while it occurred.
If we're talking here about science, you do not ask a rapist if his rape victim enjoyed the rape, and then translate that to the American public as science. Well, nobody minds being raped. They all enjoy it. We asked these experts, and the experts have told us. The experts were the rapists.
Dr. Clarence Tripp, one of Kinsey's original team members, offered this comment on Green's molestation of children.
Well, here's this man with hundreds of contacts. There was never a charge against him. He was never arrested for anything. All the children thought he was wonderful. All the mothers thought he was wonderful.
The idea that the children enjoyed being molested by Mr. Green is shocking enough. But the suggestion becomes even more appalling with the testimony of Jonathan Gathorne Hardy, a Kinsey biographer, who is one of the few people who have been allowed to view Kinsey's private records. Speaking about their practice of keeping files secret, Hardy said, "The Kinsey Institute is nervous people will read the journals. Rex King described having sex with this little girl, this little boy. I think the Kinsey Institute felt right-wing figures would pluck out things. I think they are right to keep them under cover. There are descriptions of King buggering boys nigh on 13 who doesn't enjoy it. I mean, it's quite sort of harsh stuff, some of it." But the most disturbing evidence comes from Kinsey's so-called scientific tables, wherein he describes the sexual responses of young children.
When I was reading Kinsey's book in the first place, and I looked at the tables, table 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, and these were tables with ages of children on the left-hand side, and then orgasm in one panel, and timed orgasm, time of orgasm in the next one.
In Kinsey's tables 31 through 34, he documented the timed orgasms of children as young as 2 months old, recording their responses down to the 10th of a second. The findings are so extreme that one child, a 4-year-old, is said to have had 26 orgasms within a 24-hour period. For Dr. Reisman, the obvious question was, where did Kinsey get such information?
And I looked at those charts and graphs. I can't tell you how long it took me to try to process what I was seeing. I said, this is the torture of children.
At the base of Table 31, Kinsey tells us that the data is based on actual observation of 317 males. Then on page 177 of the male volume, Kinsey writes, "Orgasm is in our records for a female babe of 4 months." But how would anyone recognize such a response in a young child? Kinsey wrote that among pre-adolescent boys and among younger females, orgasm is not so readily recognized, partly because of the lack of ejaculate.
And so I said, what did this man, this Kinsey, call an orgasm? Right. I mean, it's an obvious question, isn't it? I mean, first of all, this was not possible, but second of all, what did he call? Well, I saw he documented it on page 160 and 161 in Kinsey's book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. He described specifically what he called an orgasm amongst these children.
Kinsey defined orgasm for pre-adolescent children with the following description: a gradual and sometimes prolonged build-up to orgasm, which involves still more violent convulsions of the whole body, heavy breathing, groaning, sobbing, or more violent cries, sometimes with an abundance of tears, especially among younger children.
And he said there were 6 categories. He called them 6 categories of orgasm, and he had category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And included in these categories of what he called an orgasm were screaming, writhing in pain, hysterics, especially among younger children. He put that in parentheses, especially among younger children, parentheses. He said that the children had convulsions. Those were his words. He said they fainted. He said they struck the partner. He called it the partner. This is the man who's raping the child. Okay. They struck the partner and tried to get away. And he said that those were all examples for him, of orgasm.
Kinsey made it clear that this data was supplied by adult observers, who were defined as pedophiles by Kinsey's own team members, as you will hear later on. Kinsey wrote, "Some males suffer excruciating pain and may scream. The males in the present group, by which he meant pre-adolescent boys, become similarly hypersensitive before the arrival of actual orgasm, will fight away from the partner, and may make violent attempts to avoid climax, although, he said, they derive definite pleasure from the situation." Kinsey biographer James H. Jones was a 1998 Pulitzer Prize finalist for his biography on Kinsey. In the Yorkshire documentary, Jones had this to say about Kinsey's description of child orgasm.
If you read those words, what he's talking about is kids who are screaming, kids who are protesting in every way they can the fact that their bodies, that their persons are being violated.
Kinsey's desire to document the most depraved sexual behavior led him to work with a man who seemed to personify evil itself, a Nazi pedophile named Dr. Fritz von Balusek. Years after the war, von Balusek was arrested and put on trial for the murder of a 10-year-old girl who had been found naked and throttled on a piece of wasteland. The German authorities suspected von Balusek of the crime because the same girl had been listed among several hundred children he had raped, the details of which he had recorded in his pseudo-scientific diaries. The German newspapers called him the most important pedophile in the criminal history of Berlin. The full number of children he abused and ultimately murdered is still unknown. During the war, von Balusek was the commandant of the Polish town of Jędrzejów. There he threatened the children with certain death if they refused his sexual desires. What he recorded in his diaries of how he treated these children was so criminal that during his trial, the judge cried out, quote, "This is no longer human."
And in the process, they found that he had been corresponding extensively with Kinsey.
The German authorities learned that von Balusek and Kinsey had a working relationship, and that Dr. Kinsey was well aware of the vicious abuse the Nazi pedophile was inflicting upon innocent children. At his trial, the judge said to von Balusek, "I got the impression that you got to the children in order to impress Kinsey and to deliver him material." To which von Balusek replied, "Kinsey himself asked me for that." While German media documented the story heavily, the American press, under the powerful influence of the tax-exempt foundations, gave almost no attention to the story, even though Kinsey's research, which had turned the country upside down, was almost certainly based in part on the sexual abuse done by a Nazi pedophile during the Second World War. Kinsey's own sadomasochistic tendencies have been documented by a number of biographers. James Jones revealed that Kinsey once climbed into a bathtub and circumcised himself with a pocket knife without the benefit of anesthesia. Another account of Kinsey's extreme self-abuse came about when his research was under investigation. Kinsey went to a basement, tied one end of a rope to an exposed ceiling pipe and the other end around his scrotum, then stood on a chair and jumped off.
The abuse that he inflicted on his organs, on his sexual organs, were very directly identified in his death. That was orchitis. That was a serious inflammation and disease that he inflicted upon himself that was basically involved in his final death. Now, the attempt to claim that Kinsey died of a heart attack is a perfectly reasonable thing to try to do. It's kind of embarrassing to say that the father of the entire sexual revolution, who has trained all of our sex educators in the United States of America basically, died because he had so abused himself doing the activity that they tell everybody is okay, that he died of this terrible and very painful experience.
There was also a pedophile organization in this country. They cooperated with us, and some of them who are not, of course, not incarcerated, they came and gave us information.
Dr. Reisman believes the pedophile organization mentioned by Gephardt may have been the nucleus for what would become NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association. While child molestation is a crime in any circumstance, the members of NAMBLA claim that their intentions are out of love for the children they molest. Yet this cover of a NAMBLA bulletin, which they called their back-to-school issue, paints quite a different picture. It shows a frightened boy cornered by two adult men who are about to force him into sexual contact, and is more consistent with the information found in the Kinsey reports, that children are in fact being raped and tormented by the pedophiles who prey upon them. To this day, NAMBLA looks to Alfred Kinsey as their inspiration, saying that gay liberationists in general, and boy lovers in particular, should know Kinsey's work and hold it dear. Implicit in Kinsey is the struggle we fight today. In 1994, an underground film was released titled Chicken Hawk: Men Who Love Boys. The film documented the lives of certain members of NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association. The word chicken hawk is a reference in the gay community to older men who prey upon underage children, boys in particular.
I have all my life been attracted to younger boys.
Where are the boys? Boys are everywhere. You don't have. There's no one single place. There's the mall, the supermarket, the street, the sports event.
I can look out my window and see the school, and it's like Moses looking across to the promised land.
He kept making excuses to pull up his shirt and show me his belly in a highly flirtatious way to any ordinary boy lover such as myself, a very exciting and appealing way.
Now, the Queen's Vernacular was considered to be the #1 gay lexicon dictionary for homosexual language. 12,000 words in this dictionary, and you open it up, and their mascot is, as was the mascot in The Advocate, a boy, Boy Scout in this case. And the 12,000 words that are in here all relate to the in language, the cant that's being used within the homosexual movement amongst homosexuals. What do all these words mean? Well, they had a certain meaning for the homosexual world that the straight world didn't understand. It's another language. And some of those words we compiled we did an analysis of these words. And we found that the #1 quoted word, in order of importance, was a chicken, which relates to boys. Chicken, a young recruit, any boy under the age of consent, heterosexual, fair of face, and unfamiliar with homosexuality. There are 254 words there that deal with sex with boys.
One of the most disturbing sequences in the film Chicken Hawk were a series of interviews done with parents whose children were being openly preyed upon in a small community by this pedophile, a man named Leland Stevenson. He is shown openly preying upon underage children, looking for an opportunity to molest them.
So what happened?
What? You made the phone ring.
Oh, you made the phone ring? Oh, well, let's see how you did that.
Oh, geez, you're just texting record. No, you get in trouble for this.
He was so eager to tell me when his birthday was, and he was going to be 15 in less than a month on the 1st of December. And this is what life is about. This is what real life is about. I would say that he was in bloom, and that's it. The flower is responding to warmth. That is, I as a human being am bathing him in a certain kind of celestial warmth.
The frustration of the parents interviewed in this film is not unlike that of parents across America who live in fear of seeing their children violated by sexual predators.
I'd probably kill him. Honest, I probably would, if he would have bothered my kids.
You know, they prey on these children and how they can stand up and tell people what they believe in and that there's nothing that you can do about it. I don't understand our judicial system, that's for sure.
Chicken Hawk, Men Who Love Boys, stands as a powerful indicator of the damage done to America in its post-Kinsey era. We remind the audience that the group NAMBLA, who are the focus of this film, claim to take their inspiration directly from Alfred Kinsey. And while many in the gay community would deny that homosexuality is linked to pedophilia, it is worth noting that the very founder of the gay rights revolution, Harry Hay, consistently advocated the inclusion of NAMBLA in gay pride parades. In fact, here is a photo of Hay marching in a parade with the words, "NAMBLA walks with me," written on his back. Needless to say, Hay had been persuaded by his chief influence, Alfred Kinsey.
Well, there's a huge connection between Alfred Kinsey and NAMBLA. In fact, NAMBLA has relied upon Kinsey's research for years. Kinsey tried to make pedophilia seem acceptable.
Kinsey's argument was that it was society's reaction to pedophiles that caused the real trauma of child molestation. Members of NAMBLA will often refer to this quote from Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, where Kinsey wrote that when children are constantly warned by parents and teachers against contacts with adults, they are ready to become hysterical as soon as any older person approaches, or stops and speaks to them in the street, or fondles them. Some of the more experienced students of juvenile problems have come to believe that the emotional reactions of the parents, police officers, and other adults who discover that the child has had such a contact may disturb the child more seriously than the sexual contacts themselves. The current hysteria over sex offenders may very well have serious effects on the ability of many of these children to work out sexual adjustments some years later.
In Kinsey's view, a lot of sex crime was really not crime at all. He seemed to worship sexual experience. I mean, he had a 24/7 obsession with sex long before he attained the position at Indiana University. So for him, all forms of sexual experience, to one degree or another, could have merit that were outside the pale of traditional morality.
Like Kinsey, many pedophiles refuse to acknowledge that their sexual involvement with children qualifies as child molestation.
Kinsey said some of the most brilliant things imaginable about that. Pedophilia is an almost non-existent kind of crime, and the thing that he hated most about it is that people use words like child molestation. What is that? Nobody knows. As Kinsey said, by this kind of paranoia, you do the child more damage for life than all the pedophiles in the world would do.
Is it true that a vast majority of homosexual men admit to having engaged in pedophilia at some point?
Oh, yeah, surely. There's a vast majority of homosexual males are on record within the homosexual literature itself. Even The Advocate admitted to at minimum 21%, and we had up to 70-some% by other homosexual publications and researchers. And one of them, one of the research publications came out of the Kinsey Institute. When we have this high rate of AIDS amongst young men who've been infected as boys, which means that they were basically being sexually assaulted. This is what I consider mass murder when you're talking about thousands of boys who have been molested by men who end up with AIDS. And we have a statement by one of the, in The Advocate, by one of the leaders in the homosexual movement who says these boys are being used as sex toys.
While groups like NAMBLA seem to represent an extreme viewpoint, the reality is that their philosophy is embraced by leading members of the academic community in what is called sexology, the study of human sexuality.
From the late 60s and early 70s, both in the US and in the UK, there was what's called a paedophile liberation movement, and this put forward the notion very volubly that it's perfectly all right for men to have, or indeed women, for adults to have, quotes, consensual sexual relationships with children of any age.
There was never any science in all this. It's got nothing to do with science. It's always been political. It's always been people's own sexual perversions that have driven them. And now that drives those sexual perversions into the schoolroom in the form of sex education curricula.
Some of the leading pedophile supporters include the late Dr. John Money of Johns Hopkins University, Dr. John DiCecco, Professor Gilbert Hurt, and Dr. Hubert Kennedy, all out of San Francisco University. Perhaps the most influential was the late Dr. Vern Bulla from the Center for Sex Research at California State University, Northridge. Each of these men have either been editors for or have appeared in the Netherlands publication Paideia, the Journal of Pedophilia, a pseudo-academic journal specifically dedicated to normalizing and ultimately legalizing child molestation in society. Also appearing in Paideia was Dr. Ralph Underwager, who was often called as an expert witness in court cases involving child abuse. In his 1991 interview with Paideia, Underwager stated that pedophiles can boldly and courageously affirm what they choose. They can say that what they want is to find the best way to love, an acceptable expression of God's will for love and unity. It may take people being arrested. Revolutionaries have always risked arrest. As alarming as this is, during our investigation, we were surprised at the number of people who seemed to accept the pedophile philosophy.
And how do you feel about the issue of child pornography?
I kind of think that it probably doesn't make sense in the same way that nothing else makes sense, but unlike a lot of people who just have this visceral reaction to it, I kind of feel like if people are having sex and if they just want to do it, openly, it really shouldn't make a difference what age people are.
If they're old enough to bleed, it's all good, as far as women are concerned.
Today, the two leading institutes that promote pedophilia are the Kinsey Institute in Bloomington, Indiana, which receives more than $700,000 a year in taxpayer funding, and in San Francisco, the Institute for the Advanced Study of Human Sexuality, a private institution founded by Kinsey's homosexual lover and co-author Wardell B. Pomeroy. Despite its storefront appearance, the Institute is said to be the Harvard University for all human sexuality training.
This institute creates the PhDs, the master's degree people, the teachers, the bachelor's degrees, the safe sex educators, and a whole variety of other AIDS prevention people that go into the schoolrooms all over the country and teach children about homosexuality, heterosexuality, bisexuality, bestiality, condoms, and all the rest of it. Teach sex. In all cases, these are people who are Kinseyan trained.
On their official website, the Institute states that there need to be sociosexual activities available to those disadvantaged because of age. This is a veiled reference to children, and that the Institute calls them disadvantaged because it's illegal for them to engage in sex. The Institute's website declares it is the sexual right of all people to engage in sexual acts or activities of any kind whatsoever, and that people have the right to sexual entertainment, including sexually explicit materials dealing with the full range of sexual behavior. If taken literally, these so-called rights would obviously include pedophilia and child pornography. Beyond all this, The Institute's founding director, Wardell Pomeroy, wrote the book Boys and Sex, in which he promoted the idea of boys having sex with animals, such as a dog, a horse, or a bull. Pomeroy also stated that incest between adults and younger children can prove to be a satisfying and enriching experience. Many of the PhDs who teach in our universities have not only been associated with the Journal of Pedophilia, but have also served as the board members for pornographic magazines like Penthouse Forum. These are the people who have designed the programs for sex education in America. Because Kinsey chose to define the pain and suffering of abused children as orgasm, he then argued that children were sexual from birth and should be taught about having sex as soon as possible. While most who promote the programs probably don't know it, this thinking is what lies behind the idea of teaching sex education to kindergartners.
I remember him using this in his campaign against me, saying Barack Obama supports teaching sex education to kindergartners. And, which I didn't know what to tell him. But it's the right thing to do, to provide age-appropriate sex education, science-based sex education, science-based sex education in the schools.
Remember that this science-based sex education begins with the so-called scientific data gathered by Kinsey's pedophiles and recorded by him in his sex reports. But the influence of Pomeroy's Sex Institute goes even beyond the academic community and into America's churches.
When the Vatican II comes through and the whole notion of liberalizing the church emerges, this group of sexologists or psychologists who are trained by them go into the clergy, goes into the Catholic Church to help decide who makes a good priest. And several of our key dioceses, or the training, the places where the clergy are trained, bring in pornography from the Institute for the Advanced Study of Human Sexuality to train priests the same way the medical profession has been trained. Desensitizing the priests on issues of homosexuality and promiscuity and bisexuality and everything else, using that pornography to desensitize them and condition them, and in many cases, to seduce them.
But the fallout has extended into mainstream Protestant churches as well, with one scandal after another, involving some of America's top evangelical leaders.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
It just is a tragedy of the first order.
You know, I could give you a theological reason, Nancy. I think the enemy of our souls, Satan, assaults the church and assaults the truth.
Kinsey would have done business with the devil if it helped the research, and this is true.
Kinsey's willingness to work with the devil at one point seemed to take on a very literal meaning.
One of the interesting things I found several years ago in researching the Satanist Aleister Crowley was the influence that he has had on so many people here in the United States of America. And one of the men that he had influenced was Alfred Kinsey.
After publishing his male and female reports, Kinsey began to travel abroad and study sexuality in foreign countries. In his book, Kinsey co-author Wardell Pomeroy wrote that Kinsey went looking for a prized item, the diaries of Aleister Crowley.
Crowley died just a year before Kinsey's book came out.
Crowley was a famous and highly controversial British occultist in the early part of the 20th century. his sexual exploits in bizarre and sometimes deadly satanic rituals had been exposed in the London newspapers.
He also talked about taking a virgin and having sexual relations with her, and then upon a climax to actually murder her, cut her in 6 pieces, and put the names of the various demon gods on those 6 limbs, those 6 parts of her body.
Taking the name for the Antichrist in the Bible, Crowley called himself the Beast 666. His famous saying was, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," by which he justified all forms of immorality. The Hellfire motto was, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." The Hellfire Club was a part of the so-called gentlemen's clubs of 17th and 18th century England.
And Benjamin Franklin would go and visit that at the times when he came to visit England, yeah.
At worst, it involved the indulgence of satanic rites and sacrifices. The club to which Franklin belonged was established by Francis Dashwood, a member of Parliament and friend of Franklin. The club allegedly took part in basic forms of satanic worship. In addition to taking part in the occult, orgies and parties with prostitutes were also said to be the norm. Franklin's connection to the Hellfire Club is disturbing enough, but becomes especially dark when one considers the grisly discovery made 200 years after his death. On February 11th, 1998, the Sunday Times of London reported that workmen have dug up the remains of 10 bodies hidden beneath the former London home of Benjamin Franklin, the founding father of American independence. The remains of 4 adults and 6 children were discovered during the restoration of Franklin's home at 36 Craven Street. The Times reported that initial estimates are that the bones are about 200 years old and were buried at the time Franklin was living in the house. Most of the bones show signs of having been dissected, sawn, or cut. One skull has been drilled with several holes. The Associated Content even published an article titled "Ben Franklin and His Membership in the Hellfire Club, Founding Father or Satanic Killer." But more than a century later, the Hellfire motto would be adopted by British occultist Aleister Crowley, who was often called the wickedest man in the world. Like Francis Dashwood and the Hellfire members, Crowley took part in satanic rituals, most famously at his Abbey Thelema in Sicily, a name taken from Francois Rabelais' anti-Christian parodies. He was a Freemason and a Rosicrucian who made Do What Thou Wilt famous through the 20th century, with followers like L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, Harvard professor and drug guru Timothy Leary, and even Beatles founder John Lennon. Crowley is often credited with sparking the 1960s cultural revolution, the do-your-own-thing mentality dedicated to sex, drugs, and rock and roll. What could be called the modern legacy of men like Franklin, Dashwood, and the Hellfire Club.
Crowley had a sex temple and had practiced group sex and orgies and what have you, and so-called sex magic. Crowley was into pedophilia. He was into justifying his pedophilia. In fact, he had said, "Let me seduce the boys of England." He wanted to seduce them, and then he starts talking about sodomy and it should be acceptable. So, it was quite shocking, especially back then.
Pomeroy writes that Crowley's curious magnetism drew people from all over the world, who came and became his sexual slaves. Some of these women left their husbands to enter the temple. They held group orgies as part of their ritual and included in them the small children the women had brought. Pomeroy wrote that Crowley was called by Lord Douglas the wickedest man who ever lived, and his sexual history alone was enough to earn him the title he gloried in, the Beast. Crowley kept a diary up to his death. 2 weeks after Kinsey tracked down these papers in England, he found himself in the temple that the Beast had founded in Sicily. He further reveals that inside the abbey, Kinsey found paintings, life-sized representations of sexual activity, including children. Kinsey is pictured here inside Crowley's temple, known as the Abbey Thelema, where he performed his satanic rituals. While across from Kinsey is another man named Kenneth Anger. Anger was a close acquaintance who appeared in some of Kinsey's sex films, made in the attic of his Bloomington home. As an avant-garde filmmaker, Anger was deeply involved in the occult. He directed films with titles such as Lucifer Rising and The Invocation of My Demon Brother.
Kenneth Anger is a co-founder of Anton LaVey's Church of Satan, and Kenneth Anger also was, had a penchant for younger men, for sure. Bobby Beausoleil was his live-in boyfriend. That's the same Bobby Beausoleil that committed the first murder, killing Hinman for Charles Manson. That was his live-in boyfriend. He played Lucifer in one of his occult movies that extolled the virtues of Aleister Crowley's magic and what have you.
In this image from one of Anger's films, we see Bobby Beausoleil, who would later become one of Charles Manson's killers. He's standing next to a doorway with Crowley's maxim, "Do what thou wilt," a phrase that certainly fit with Kinsey's own view of human sexuality. An older Kenneth Anger is pictured here, with the name Lucifer tattooed on his chest. So important was Anger's relationship with Kinsey that to this day, the Kinsey Institute Library features a Kenneth Anger collection with an archive of Anger's films as well as the correspondence between him and Alfred Kinsey.
One way or another, the net effect is the same. Kinsey was fostering much of the same revolution that Crowley had begun over in England and was helping continue what Crowley hoped would take place in the United States of America.
This research has been possible because over the past 15 years, some tens of thousands of people have cooperated.
Mass media seems to have always been on the side of Kinsey and his philosophy. A philosophy carried out by Hugh Hefner in 1953 when he launched Playboy magazine. That same year, Kinsey released his K-Bomb, Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, the second book in his report on human sexuality. Hefner made an immediate association between his soft porn magazine and Kinsey's research.
I referred to it in the first introduction to the first issue and called it the other great book that was coming out in 1953. Max Lerner, the historian and a good friend of mine, said that Kinsey was the researcher and I was the pamphleteer. And it's an interesting way of looking at it. I certainly do think that in a very real way, the sexual revolution began in 1953, with the second book and the beginning of Playboy.
Hugh Hefner had been under the influence of Kinseyan philosophy since the release of the male volume in 1948. He had even written about it in a college publication years before he started Playboy magazine. Half a century later, in Playboy's 50th anniversary issue, Hefner paid special tribute to Alfred Kinsey, celebrating the man who had helped him launch the sexual revolution. But Playboy represented more than just nude photos of the girl next door. According to Hefner, the magazine was, quote, a statement of rebellion without question. The first official Playboy playmate was named Janet Pilgrim, directly intended to mock America's Puritan heritage. In time, Hefner would publish the Playboy philosophy, a new morality for the post-Kinsey era. Just as Kinsey had gone all over the country, preaching the message of sexual reform, Hefner followed his example, giving speeches, appearing on talk shows, and speaking in public forums as the pamphleteer for Kinsey's sexual revolution.
So what you're saying, Mr. Hefner, is that we should encourage premarital sexual relations?
I think that we should encourage the notion that sex can be right and proper in marriage or out of marriage.
In time, Hefner set up the Playboy Foundation, which became, quote, one of the major sources of income for the Kinsey Institute. In 1983, Dr. Judith Reisman was appointed by the Juvenile Division of the Department of Justice to investigate the images in Playboy, along with Penthouse and Hustler magazines. The reason for the study was due to the rise of violent sex crimes committed by young adults against even younger children. Those who were committing these crimes were often found to have copies of Playboy and Penthouse magazines in their possession. But what could be in these magazines, often thought to be harmless, that would compel young teenage boys to commit violent sex crimes against other children?
You're going to have an increase in sexual crimes by children against children and by adults against children. You cannot do the kind of programming of people's brains, minds, memories, and bodies. The connection between the brain goes all the way down from the retina all the way down the central nervous system and into the genitals. You can't show people those kinds of pictures and arouse them in that way and not think that they're going to act out. That's what's going to happen. And you just simply can't do that to billions of people at one time, to masses of a population.
In her Department of Justice study, Dr. Reisman revealed that from 1953 to 1982, Playboy and eventually Penthouse and Hustler magazines had published approximately 9,000 images of children involved in sexual scenarios, an average of about 8 to 9 images per issue.
That cartoon says, can you read it? Well, anyway, it says, thank you, good night, Betty Lou, thanks for a really swell evening. Now here we do see the penis. One of the few cartoons that we have a male penis. Of course, it appears that the gentleman has murdered Betty Lou. She's tied up in one of these leaf bags.
Please understand, the most severe images we are unable to show you. Dr. Reisman demonstrates how the cartoon imagery of children progressed into real-life images, either of children or of legal-aged women who were made to look like obviously underage girls. Over time, the scenarios suggested greater degrees of sexual aggression and violence, including murder. Some of the following cartoons are disturbing, such as this image from Playboy of an infant child masturbating, with a title that reads, "Getting Off." Not surprisingly, the cartoon supports the Kinseyan view that children are sexual from birth. Children are often shown to be the aggressors, as in this image of a small child speaking to an older man with a candy cane. The caption reads, "No thank you, nice man. I don't want to go for a ride in your car. Why don't we just go up to my place and BALL?" This image from Penthouse has 3 young girls in conversation. The one with the candy cane says, "Yeah, and he gives you one of these just for straight sex, no deviations." This Playboy image is of a young girl putting her dress back on. She says to the older man in the bathrobe, "You call that being molested?" In this scene, a young girl is in bed with an older man. On the phone, she says, "Hello, Mommy. I met this nice political leader from the moral majority on Capitol Hill." Incest is another prominent theme of the magazines. This Playboy image shows a young girl in bed with an obviously older man. The caption reads, "Everything's fine, Mama. Uncle William and I are playing a game called Consequences." This cartoon from Hustler magazine is of a father molesting his high school daughter. She says, "Daddy, not only is what you're doing illegal, it's being done badly." Many scenarios involve characters that most children recognize, such as Santa Claus and the Wizard of Oz characters, in which Dorothy is either raped or molested by her companions. In this cartoon, the Santa Claus has an ecstatic look on his face because the little girl sitting on his lap has her hand inside his pants. In this one, the Santa Claus has his pants around his ankles as he rapes an obviously frightened little girl on his lap. Hugh Hefner is said to have been guilty of statutory rape. According to biographer Russell Miller in his book, Bunny, The Real Story of Playboy, Hefner himself enjoyed making love to a schoolgirl who had attended his daughter's Sweet 16 birthday party. Miller's evidence was based on the testimony of the staff that worked in the Playboy mansion at the time. As with Larry Flynt, Hefner was never charged with a crime. A major breakthrough for Hefner's Playboy magazine and child pornographers in general was the film Pretty Baby, starring Brooke Shields, a film briefly remembered during the recent controversy over the images of 15-year-old Miley Cyrus. Pretty Baby was the story of a 12-year-old girl who grows up with a prostitute mother and ends up losing her virginity in a whorehouse. People magazine ran a story saying Brooke Shields, 12, stirs a furor over child porn in films. Playboy featured images from the film, along with an interview with the film's director, Louis Malle. In the interview, Malle said, "When Playboy requested a photo that would express my personal vision of eroticism, I sent a shot of my 2-year-old daughter, Justine, naked. This led to the photos above of Brooke Shields, whom I cast in the title role of my new film, Pretty Baby." Research reveals that 77% of child molesters of boys and 87% of child molesters of girls admitted imitating the sexual behavior they had seen in pornography they had watched. As early as 1971, Reader's Digest published an article titled "What Sex Offenders Say About Pornography." It could be concluded that some force impelling towards sex crime has been operating on younger males in the United States.
Because of the huge impact that the porn industry has had, conservative estimates say the highest service revenue on the internet, over $3 billion a year in income just on internet porn. And those are very conservative figures. I'm sure they're much higher, with between 500 and 700 new sites coming on a day on the internet.
And who could forget the disturbing warning given by serial killer Ted Bundy in his final interview with Dr. James Dobson just hours before his execution in 1989.
Listen, I'm no social scientist, and I haven't done a survey. I mean, I don't pretend that I know what John Q. Citizen thinks about this. But I've lived in prison for a long time now. And I've met a lot of men who were motivated to commit violence just like me. And without exception, every one of them was deeply involved in pornography, without question, without exception, deeply influenced and consumed by an addiction to pornography.
Despite these warnings, the so-called soft porn industry has been normalized in America, partly because some of the most powerful social and political leaders of the last half-century have given interviews and appeared in these magazines, helping to make them part of America's mainstream. William O. Douglas and retired Justice Arthur Goldberg wrote articles for Playboy magazine. Perhaps most famous was Jimmy Carter's Playboy interview in 1976 as a presidential candidate. While ultimately considered a political blunder, it undoubtedly sent a message of acceptability to the up-and-coming generation, a society so overwhelmed with temptation that even the most would-be pious members find it all but impossible to resist.